Turning your Bibles to the book of Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament. Right after the book of Psalms and Proverbs, you'll find Ecclesiastes. And we'll be in chapter 12. I guess the book of Ecclesiastes could have a subtitle called Making Sense of Life. And we might say, well, after reading it, I don't really have a fully understanding of it because Solomon is saying so much and giving sometimes a very bleak outlook on life. However, when we come to the end here in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, he is bringing us to a point, and that is really what you desire to see is where is this going? What point is being made? And this is it. So if you're there, Ecclesiastes chapter 12, look up at me if you're there. Are you there? Ecclesiastes 12, verse number 13. I want us to read it all out loud together. Would you help me in doing that today? Everyone out loud at the same time together. We'll just read verse 13. Ecclesiastes 12, verse 13. Ready? Let's begin. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. That is all of Ecclesiastes packed into one verse. I'm getting a lot of ringing up here. Do you hear that too? I'm getting a lot of ringing feedback, I guess, up here. There we go. That took care of it. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter, he says. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. He begins the synopsis of his letter really in verse number 8 down to verse number 12. And we've been looking at that in the last couple weeks. He looked at the fact that life is filled with pleasure, delight. And we saw some of that throughout the letter. He talked about how things in life and how we can enjoy life. And we took some time and we looked at how we can enjoy the pleasures of life, the delights of life. As a matter of fact, the Bible tells us that the joy of life is the gift of God here in the book of Ecclesiastes. However, times are passing and moments are fleeting. And this creates some tension sometimes to be in the moment and enjoy what is before us. He talks about that there's a time for everything and seasons, and so we enjoy the seasons, the times that we have, because we know though times will change, we have to be in that moment. Life changes. There's seasons of life from our youth to that growing, that middle-age time to then senior age of life. And sometimes we dread those things or we think that we're going to lose out as we make those changes. But God shows us that we can enjoy those seasons of life. Each season. Remember, today is the day of your youth, really. It's as young as you're ever going to be. Now, I said that 3 weeks ago, and guess what? We're all older than we were 3 weeks ago. No one stayed the same. We're all older than we were. And so today we begin again that today is the day of your youth. And you can say, well, I don't feel like a youth any longer, but today is that day. It's a matter of perspective. That's what we're looking at today. It's a matter of perspective. And so Solomon, he teaches us to enjoy those things, enjoy the simple things. Some things that he looked out and he saw among the people and that he desired, but that he no longer has. It teaches us and helps us to enjoy the simple things in life. Just those small moments, the moments that we might not count as big moments in our life, but they're moments that really bring joy. The ones that we look back on, they're the ones that we look forward to and know that it's sometimes not as much as what we're doing, but that who we're around and enjoying those moments. That led us to looking at enjoy the souls in our life, the people that surround us. Sometimes we don't really capture the value of that until it's gone or taken from us or limited in some way. We see that Though happiness is circumstantial and momentary, joy is based on knowledge, it's based on truth, and comes from within and can be lasting. And so Solomon gave us some perspective about pleasure, about delight. But then also he gave us a perspective about pain, oppression, he called it, travail. It brought tears. He says he looked out and he saw the oppression amongst men, and he saw their tears. And it was a vexation of spirit because he knew that the joys of life can sometimes be swallowed up in the pains of life. He looked out and he saw people without a comforter, no one there to console them or comfort them in their times of pain. He looked out and he saw people with no companion, someone that wasn't surrounded by friends who maybe purposely had isolated themselves from it, or some that had lost the companionship. Regardless, what he showed us was that pain sometimes comes from without. The injustices of life, the insults and the injuries, the illnesses of life, through loss, through accidents, through relationships. Sometimes we can see it coming, sometimes it blindsides us. Regardless, what it does is it brings pain. And that pain is real. And Solomon wasn't glossing over that. He showed us about that perplexing vexation of spirit, he called it, when he saw the pain of men. And then he gave a perspective from pain from inside, feelings of insecurity and inadequacy, isolation that brings on fear and frustration, often causing failure within, is because we begin to doubt and we begin to be discouraged. And it brings on that from that discouragement, depression, and other such things. And it's real. That pain is real. And it surrounds us. It can be within us. So what are we to do? We turn the focus from me, from the inside to outside, the we. Instead of asking how I am doing, we ask how we are doing, and looking to surround our lives and let who God has brought into our lives help us and strengthen us and encourage us. Sometimes we look at what we've lost rather than looking at what we have and what God has supplied. All of these are things that every person, no matter race, no matter where you're located on earth, what country of origin, where you live, location, it doesn't matter. You experience either joy or pain. No matter where you go, you say, I'm going to escape it all. I'm going to move to another country. Guess what you'll find in that other country? The same thing. It knows no boundaries of location. It knows no boundaries of class, of people. It knows no boundaries of age. And that's what Solomon was perplexed with. It was what was on his mind. And so, through the pleasure and the pain, though, of life, we gain a perspective about life. And that perspective in life, we'll look at, brings us to preparation for that one event that Solomon says comes to every single person. We'll look at that next week in closing in verse number 14. But I don't want us to move through verse 13 too quickly to get to verse 14. We're going to break down verse 13 today in our message here of looking at the perspective of life, taking a step back and gaining perspective. It's amazing that God chose to allow Solomon to write this letter to us. It was a man, I believe, who had great perspective. He had a unique perspective that we know of because he was a son of a king, King David's son. I'm going to read some verses to you if you want to write these down. That way you can go back and look at them, but I'm going to move through them somewhat quickly. But in 1 Kings chapter number 3, we find that Solomon had been given a great perspective because of who he was. Because of who he was. Really, chapter number 2 is the verse that I wanted to look at. 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 45. It says, King Solomon shall be blessed, and the throne of David shall be established before the Lord forever. He was the son of King David. Now, I believe if you've been in church or you've even been familiar with the Bible in some way, you may know of David, the king of Israel. King David, a man after God's own heart. A man, though, that wasn't perfect by any means. He had struggles. He experienced the pleasures of life and enjoying life. He saw great victories come his way, did he not? We're probably most familiar with David as he took on the giant Goliath. David and Goliath. You still hear that used in ways throughout the world when you see the underdog versus the champion, and the underdog wins, and it's a David and Goliath battle, they call it. Solomon was the son of that king, David. He grew up watching his father. He grew up watching things that had happened, and David's life was a life that wow, it had some ups and downs in it. With those great victories, though, he suffered a lot of pain.
That's right.
And some of that pain came from without. It came from his own son. Caused him a lot of pain. Having to flee for his life at times. Not King Solomon, but his other children. Absalom was one that was trying to overthrow his own father. Solomon saw a lot of this. He saw it taking place, and he was growing and learning about what David, his father, had done. And so Solomon had that perspective of where he grew up and who he was surrounded with and watching. But then Solomon became king. So not only did he have the perspective of growing up in the king's house, but he had the perspective of becoming king. He was king over Israel. So we're getting the perspective today of a king. He had position, is what that means. Now the world will tell you that that is what we are to seek after, right? If you attain the right position, if you're ruler, if you have that title behind your name, that you have arrived, is what the world tells us. Well, according to the world, Solomon had arrived. He was king in Israel. He had the position, with which that position also came power. He had the resources. He had things at his fingertips to where he could do or have anything he wanted. He could snap his fingers and something would be done. Give the command and people would move. He had position and he had power. He had fame. Also, what the world would tell us, if you reach this position, you're a Hollywood A-lister, is what they call them. If you get to that point, you're known throughout the world. People want to be like you. Solomon had fame. With that fame and with his position as king, he had fortune. As a matter of fact, studies have been done by looking at what Solomon had and the things that he owned, was that he was probably the richest man that had ever lived. You look at the wealthy today and what they can do and what they have, but they say Solomon and all of his riches would have exceeded that, even in modern day terms. It's pretty amazing, isn't it? That gives us a very unique perspective. And I want you to hear about some of these things that don't just take my word for it. I'm in 1 Kings chapter number 10, and I want to read these verses to you to give you some perspective here about this man, so we can not just take his words and say, well, what does his perspective mean to me? Listen to what he had. In 1 Kings chapter number 10, I'm just going to start reading in verse 21. It says, King Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold. Now, how many, you go to your cabinet and you pull out a cup and it's gold? Anyone in here that drinks out of that? I'm just trying to see if there's any takers. I'm going to come to your house to drink out of a gold cup. If you come to our house, I think we got those plastic, let me tell a story. My grandfather, growing up, he had those plastic, those red, what's the name of them? Solo cups. Yeah, those red Solo cups. He reused those. Matter of fact, he wouldn't even throw those away. He would reuse those, wash them out. He said, why are we throwing those away? Those are good and everything. Even though they're meant to be disposable, he's like, I'm going to make that last. A pack of those would last him a year. And the only reason he would throw them away is if they started to get a ring in them or something like that. But he would drink his coffee in those things and stuff. But nothing like what Solomon had, that's for sure. His drinking vessels were of gold. All the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were of pure gold. None were of silver. It was nothing accounted of in the days of Solomon, meaning there's no one like that in the days of Solomon. Verse 22, the king had a sea of navy of Tarshish with a navy of Haram. Once in 3 years came the navy of Tarshish bringing gold and silver, ivory, and apes and peacocks. So King Solomon exceeded all the kings of the earth for riches and wisdom. Listen to verse 24. And all the earth sought to Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put in his heart. He had wealth and he had fame. His drinking vessels were of pure gold. People would come, it says, from all the earth. They sought just to hear him and his wisdom. He had fame. He's able to give us a unique perspective, isn't he? I believe that's why God inspired him to write this letter. Solomon seemed to have it all. He had position and power. He had fame and fortune. In his own words, we go back to Ecclesiastes, and in chapter number 2, I want you to read what he said. He said in my heart, verse number 1, go to now, I approve thee with mirth. Therefore enjoy pleasure. Behold, this also is vanity, meaning it's fleeting. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of mirth, what doth it? I sought in mine heart to give myself unto wine, yet acquainting my heart with wisdom, and to lay hold on folly, till I see what was good for the sons of men, which they should do under the heaven. All the days of their life I made, look at this, great works, houses, vineyards, gardens, he says, pools of water. He had servants, maidservants, verse 7, maidservants and men servants. He had great possessions from cattle, above all that were in Jerusalem before me. He had silver, he had gold, verse number 8, and the peculiar treasure of kings and of provinces. They would bring him things from all over the world. What is he saying? He is saying, look, this is all that I had. And I want you to see something else that Solomon had that was quite amazing, something that was very unique to Solomon. It wasn't that he just had all of these riches, but he had wisdom to go along with it. Now, I want you to hear how he got this wisdom. It was quite amazing. The Bible says in the book of Second Chronicles, chapter number 1, Solomon here was on a journey. And as he slept one night, in verse number 7 of 2 Chronicles chapter 1, the Bible says, in that night did God appear unto Solomon and said unto him, ask what I shall give thee. And Solomon said unto God, thou hast showed great mercy unto David my father, and hast made me to reign in his stead. Now, O Lord, let thy promise unto David my father be established, for thou hast made me king over a people like the dust of the earth in multitude. Give me now wisdom and knowledge, verse 10, that I may go out and come in before this people, for who can judge this thy people that is so great? And God said to Solomon, because this was in thine heart, and thou hast not asked riches, wealth, or honor. Now notice that. Solomon had those things, we just covered that. He had the fame and the fortune, but that's not what he asked for. He had that because God gifted him with that. What Solomon asked of God was that he asked for wisdom and knowledge in leading God's people. We go back, God says, because this was in thine heart, and thou hast not asked for riches, wealth, or honor, nor the life of thine enemies, neither yet hast asked long life, but hast asked wisdom and knowledge for thyself, that thou mayest judge my people over whom I have made thee king. Wisdom and knowledge is granted unto thee. And I will give thee riches and wealth and honor, such as none of the kings that have had been before thee, neither shall there any after thee have the like. He says, I am going to make you unique. You didn't ask for riches and wealth. You asked for wisdom and knowledge, and I'm going to give you that. But I'm also going to give you riches and wealth too. Now, you might think at that point, if we didn't know the rest of the story, that Solomon was a man that had it all. Would you agree with me? Would you say, knowing what we know there about King Solomon, case closed? The man had it all, literally. Wisdom and knowledge of what to do. Wisdom and knowledge. When you think of that, I want you to think of these ways. In the book of Proverbs that was written by Solomon, he uses words, sometimes it seems interchangeably, but they have their own meaning. When you think of wisdom, you would think of how to do what God wants you to do. When you think of knowledge, it's the what you should do, and understanding is why you should do it. There's those three different words that are used, but they're synonymous, but they're not equal, so to speak. Knowledge, what I should do, understanding why I should do it, wisdom is how to get it done. And God gave those things to Solomon. But he also gave him the riches and the wealth and the fame to get done anything he wanted. It seems like Solomon had the perfect life. But in his own words, Solomon says in Ecclesiastes chapter 2 that he came to the point where he hated life. He hated it. I want you to hear his own words. In chapter number 2, the man that had it all. In verse number 17, he says, "Therefore I hated life." Those are his words, not mine. He says, "Because the work that is wrought under the sun is grievous unto me, for all is vanity and vexation of spirit." He said it's all fleeting, it's passing, and it vexes him because why? He had it all, but he couldn't keep it all. Why? Because there's one event that happens to every person, and that was what faced him each and every day. Is today the day that I'm going to leave it all behind, to give all this up? Every day he got older, it was on his mind, and it became a drain on him. So that's why I believe, and I took a lot of time, why Solomon was the perfect person to give us perspective of life. Because as we grow and as we look out and we see the people that have fame and fortune, and we see some people that have wisdom and all of these things, and we say, oh, if I could just be like that, if I could just do that, and we live for those things and even attain those things, we still have to wrestle with the fact they don't last forever. That there's that one event that happens to us all. So Solomon talks about the pleasures of life, he talks about the pain of life, but then he gives us perspective. Coming from the man who, you could say, seen it all, done it all. He says in verse 13, "Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter." When we say we're going to conclude, you're going to wrap it up, you're going to put the period at the end of the sentence, this is it. This is what it all boils down to. The end. You watch a movie, you read a book, you listen to a story, and you come and those final words, the end. There's nothing more to add. With life, as we know it here, there's not a part 2. There's not a sequel. We don't take our last breath here and then say, oh, we're going to be resurrected and come back as something else. There's nothing in God's Word that teaches that. And so regarding this life here, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. The word "here," he likened himself, he called himself in verse number 9, if you're back in Ecclesiastes 12, verse 9, he says, "And moreover, because the preacher was wise." He called himself the preacher. The word preacher just means the proclaimer, the one making the proclamation. He said, I want you to hear the conclusion. I've talked about my life. I've talked about what satisfied and what didn't. I've talked about, though, the conclusions that I've come to throughout life. And he was a man that wrote many proverbs, many things that help life. And proverbs aren't an end-all, and one proverb doesn't just solve everything, but it helps to give perspective, and it helps to give guidance in life. That's what the proverbs were. And so let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. The whole matter is he's talking about every part of life. You could say it this way: let us hear the conclusion of life. Now, if you would say the richest man in the world, possibly the most famous man in the world, son of a king and now the king, were to call you in, to summons you to his palace, courts, and he said, I want to give you some perspective. I want you to listen. Do you think you would give him your attention? You think if you were summoned there, that you would listen to what he said? Here's what he says. Here's the conclusion of it all. Fear God and keep his commandments. For this is the whole duty of man. Are those words overwhelming or underwhelming to you? Let me ask that question again. Are those words overwhelming? Can't be done? Or underwhelming? I thought there was more to life than that. You mean I traveled all the way here to hear from the preacher, and he says, let's hear the conclusion of the whole matter. This man, that he's got it all, he's done it all. I'm listening and looking for this great oratory from King Solomon. And he says, fear God and keep his commandments. Does that overwhelm you? I can't do that. Keep God's commandment. Don't you know we've all come short? To fear God? Well, yeah, I know that there's a God. That may be our initial response. But there's so much more to it in these words. I want to break these words down. Because there's a reason God chose the wisest man and the richest man, the most famous man, to help us draw a conclusion. He would have the attention of all the listeners. And God wanted this message to get out. He didn't choose the herald in the kingdom, the man whose job it was to sound out the words of the king. He gave it directly to the king, and he said, the king, I want you to give this message to the people. It's that important. You're not going to send a messenger to do it. I want you to do it. They'll listen to you. And through his experiences of what he did, what he saw, what he gained, he comes to a conclusion about life. Fear God and keep his commandments. For this is the whole duty of man. Let's look at that last phrase before we get into the 2 points of fearing God and keeping his commandments. The whole duty of man. What is the duty of man? The word duty is something along the lines of obeying. It's used sometimes in the realm of military, of taking orders. I'm going to go serve. I'm going to do my duty. Some have said, I've served in duty for my country. There's high regard there. We're talking about the whole duty of man before God. What is it that God had given the children of Israel up to this point that they had to guide them? It's a 3-letter word. It's something that was called, he gave through Moses to the children of Israel to guide them. It was like their guidebook. The law. There was a law. It wasn't the law of the land, it was the law of God. God had given it. But beyond the law, which was limited, and the law wasn't meant to draw people to God, it was meant to show that people couldn't earn their way to God. They couldn't keep it. What really God wanted it to do was to cause people to look upon God and desire after Him. And here is the conclusion that God was bringing. Let me give you these verses, the whole duty of man. In Deuteronomy, chapter number 6, verse number 1, if you want to write this down, given Moses these, he says, "Now these are the commandments, the statutes, and the judgments which the Lord your God commanded to teach you." Now, if Solomon is saying, I want you to fear God and keep commandments, shouldn't we know what are those commandments? Because this is my duty to obey them. He says, verse 2, he says, "That thou mightest fear the Lord thy God, to keep all His statutes and His commandments, which I command thee, thou and thy son of thy life, and that thy days may be prolonged." He said, here's your life. Solomon's saying, here's the conclusion of the whole matter, and this is the duty that you have before you. God says to them, "Hear therefore, O Israel, and observe to do it." This is Deuteronomy 6, verse 3. "That it may be well with thee, and that thou may increase mightily, as the Lord God of thy fathers hath promised thee, in the land that floweth with milk and honey. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. And thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy might. And these words which I command thee this day shall be in thine heart, and thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children." I'm going to pause here. We'll come back to that in just a moment. But he said, here's duty. The whole duty of man, which God has given, is to obey what He had said. That's what life is about. That's the perspective that He has given. That our duty to obey the Lord is accomplished by fearing God and keeping His commandments. And so you're enlisted in God's work. And He says, here's the duty. Here's what you're to do. Fear God and keep His commandments. That's your orders. Are you ready to embrace those orders? Are you ready to see what perspective that gives of life? It would change our perspective of life and help us to truly have an understanding of life if we would understand those orders. That's what we were created for. Let's break that down. What's it mean to fear God? Well, Solomon, this wise man, had written Proverbs and given those to the people, and was filled with this wisdom that was excelling above everyone else. Wisdom that only comes from God, because Solomon said in his own Proverbs, in Proverbs chapter 2, verse 6, "For the Lord giveth wisdom. Out of His mouth cometh knowledge and understanding." There's those three words that we mentioned. But it comes from God. The Lord giveth wisdom. In the New Testament, we're to ask wisdom. "If any man lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who giveth to all men liberally and upbraideth not." Meaning, he'll not scorn you if you ask for wisdom. He desires for you to ask wisdom. Matter of fact, when Solomon had the opportunity to ask for anything, he asked for wisdom, and God was pleased with what he asked for. So not only does the Lord give wisdom, the Lord wants us to ask wisdom. And Solomon's Proverbs say this in Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 7, "The fear of the Lord," let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. What is it? Fear God. "The fear of the Lord," he said, "is the beginning of knowledge. But fools despise wisdom and instruction." Meaning the fear of the Lord is the beginning of what God wants you to do, of what life is all about. You're going to never truly grasp what life is about without a fear of God. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? And that's pretty wise that Solomon could take the whole of life and God inspired him to put it down into just a phrase or two. That's where wisdom and knowledge begins. It begins with the proper fear of God. Now, what's the proper fear of God? It's a reverential fear of remembering who God is and putting Him in His proper place. Who is God? He's the creator, isn't He? He shows us how we got here. He's the sustainer. It shows us how we remain here. We see Him in His beauty. We see Him in His majesty. He's the King of kings, the Lord of lords. He's the sovereign over all. Everything is in His power. By Him was everything created. We remember God. Part of fearing God is just remembering Him. Solomon's going to write some words later on in the Proverbs, in Proverbs chapter number 3, that we're to trust the Lord with all of our heart. Why? Because of who He is. Why can we trust God? Because we remember who He is. He is God and I'm not. I can trust Him. Trust the Lord with all thine heart and lean not unto thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge Him and He shall direct thy paths. Why should we do that? Because He's God. Why should I acknowledge Him? Because He's God. Why should I trust Him? Because He is God. You see, that's the conclusion of the whole matter, is remembering there's a God in heaven. And He loves you and He gave you life. You're not here on your own. See, that's where a lot of people get off track. They don't want to believe in a God, but then we don't understand, well, how did we get here? Well, let's try to explain it in our own terms. And the more we try to explain it, the more lack of understanding we have. We got to account for this and account for that. And just when we thought we had everything accounted for, there's something else that comes. And mankind is always trying to live their life and do things apart from God, only to be drawn all the way back around to the argument that there's a God and He's confronting them. And why do we try to escape that? It's because when we find out and remember that there's a God, now we're accountable. And now I've got to face Him. And Solomon says, quit running. Fear God. Remember who He is. And then regard God. When we remember God, it's remembering Him in His proper place. When we regard God, it's remembering our place. Remember God, He is God. Regard God, I'm not. He's God, I'm not. When I regard God, it's regarding, okay, fear God and keep His commandments. Why would I keep His commandments? Because He's God. I'm regarding who God is. All the proverbs that Solomon had given the people to find out and to seek after God and to hear the instruction of the Lord. To forget not God's ways and His commandments, to trust in the Lord with all their heart and lean not into their own understanding. Why? Because He is God and you're not. That's what it means to fear God, to reverence Him, to respect Him, to honor Him. Why? Because He's God. You don't have the privilege to do this. You say, no one caused me to breathe. I just did that myself. Well, who made the oxygen that you breathe that keeps you alive? Can you create that? We may have tools. You may say, well, I can get on an oxygen machine and I can do that and that can give me that. Well, who created that? And who gave someone the ability to create that? You see, it all boils down, you can go back as far as you want, it all boils down to God. And the moment Solomon is saying, the perspective of life, the moment you reckon there's a God, quit fighting it, quit running from it, quit denying it, there is a God. And He created you. And He gave you life. And it's your responsibility to fear Him. That's the duty of man. He is God, and I am not. Thus, he says, and keep His commandments. When you establish He's God and I'm not, then I'm not the one that makes the rules to live by. Why? Because I'm not all-knowing. I don't have all the wisdom that God has. I don't have all the understanding. I can't be everywhere where God is. And so I keep His commandments. And I find that God's commandments are not grueling. They're not for us to be kept bound and in. It's actually freeing. They free us because we realize within God's bounds and His commandments, and He is wise and all-knowing and everywhere, that He knows what's safe and what's not. He knows what should be done and what shouldn't be done. He knows what will bring true joy in our life and delight, and He also knows what the pain is for and how that we can bear it. He also knows that that pain might help direct us and point us back to Him so that we can trust Him. So we keep His commandments, because His commandments are true and right. That's what He was saying back to the children of Israel. He says, it'll be well with you, it'll be well with your children, and with your children's children. That's why you need to teach them. He says, love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy might. And these words which I command thee this day shall be in thine heart, and thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children. Why would you want your children to know that? Because you want the best for your children. And what's the best? The words of God. To know the Lord, to love the Lord. They are true and right, and they're for our good and for His glory. That's the conclusion that Solomon had come to. Now, I want you to see something that perplexed him. He uses a phrase over and over again, the word vanity we talked about, that means more than pointless or emptiness. It can mean fleeting or passing, but he uses a phrase called this vexation of spirit. His soul was vexed the more that he wrote and the more he realized, the more he came to the conclusion of himself, is that I haven't really done a great job of this. Now, I don't want to have a show of hands today, but how many would say as of right now, fearing God and keeping His commandments, I maybe haven't done the best at that. I'm constantly working on that. You know what would happen if we showed our hands? I think every hand in this room would be raised. If we're honest before the Lord, all of our hands would be raised. I admit mine would be up. Fearing God and keeping His commandments. But nonetheless, the wisest man on earth said, that's what it boils down to. If you really want to know true joy and you really want to discover what the purpose is of the pain and going through life, it's coming to this conclusion. If you want to just constantly be on the merry-go-round and being dizzy and not knowing where you're going to get off and what it's all about, he said, I've lived it, I've done that. There's no phrase that used to say, I've been there, done that, I got the t-shirt, right? That's what we do. We go to some place, we experience it, we get the t-shirt to remember it. Solomon is saying, I've had the life to remember some things, and guess what? A lot of it I hated. Just when you think you're going to attain all the wealth in the world, guess what? It doesn't bring the fulfillment that you thought. All the fame in the world can be taxing. Here's what he says to his listeners. Verse 12, he said, further, by these, my son, be admonished. Of making many books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. Now, some of you, that doesn't mean, okay, I'm going to quit school, because that's what it says. Much study is a weariness of the flesh. I don't need it. No, you need it, but what he's saying to this is you're never going to learn it all. That's what he's saying. There's so much to it. Just when you think you've mastered one thing, you haven't mastered it all. Some of the most brilliant minds in the world had zero common sense and practicality. Read their life. How many know the name Albert Einstein? What is he synonymous as? A genius. Most of the people would classify him as a genius. Read about his personal life. Read about how he treated family, and especially his wife. He looked at her as no more than a hired slave. that he needed to be left alone. When he got to the end of life, he was pretty much a miserable man. How many want to be the genius now? Huh. You see, it's all with perspective, right? Some of those Hollywood A-listers we talked about have taken their life, have lost it all. When you hear stories about them, they say they're miserable people. I'm not saying all of them. I'm not trying to broad brush all of them. I'm saying, though, that there's a many that are like that. But yet that's what the world says we're to attain, right? That'll bring the peace. That'll bring everything that I need, right? Wrong. We're hearing it from the man who had it all and lived it all. What is he saying will bring that peace? What is he saying that will help our lives and to give us the fulfillment in life? Fear God. Remember him and regard him. And keep his commandments because they are right and true. They will guide your life. If God brings wealth, if God brings fame into your life, live it within these boundaries and perspectives. There's nothing wrong with wealth, fame, all of those things. They're tools. They're not right and wrong. I hate the argument where people say, well, wealthy and wealth, I don't want anything to do with that because of riches and such. Riches can be a wonderful thing if you use it for the Lord and you fear God and keep his commandments with it. But if you think it's the end all and you can go live life however you want and disregard God, no, it'll make you miserable.
That's right.
Right? Money isn't the root of all evil. It's the love of money. That's not from without, it's within. Money is an inanimate object. It's what you do with it. It's what's in the heart. That's where Solomon boils us all this down. Where with it, it's dealt with in the heart. Fearing God and keeping his commandments. Why? Because I can't do it for Dave. Dave can't do it for me. It's everyone's personal story. It's your story. It's your duty. And Solomon is saying that will give perspective of life. You want to make sense of what things are going on right now? Remember God and regard him. Get into God's word and see what he has what he has commanded, what brings peace, what he has said will bring fulfillment, and do it. It's your duty for one, but that's what will really make a difference. That's what will really make a difference. It changes our perspective. It gives purpose for living. The Bible tells us in the book of James, what is our life? It is as a vapor that appeareth for a little time and vanisheth away. We have this moment, we have right now. What is our conclusion going to be? Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Can I state it this way? My words? Let's hear the conclusion of your life. What's going to be the summary of your life? And Solomon says it should be. It's our duty that we fear God and keep his commandments. We'll find, as we look at it next week, that verse 14 then, God will bring every work into judgment, every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. That prepares us for eternity. What you do with the Lord. Perspective. That's what we need, perspective. To be able to step back and to look at it. I want to close with this verse that Solomon gave. Because this is perspective. He says, better is a poor and a wise child than an old and foolish king who will no more be admonished. A poor child who will learn is better than an old king who has arrived but has stopped learning. That's perspective, isn't it? Who could he have been referring to there? I think he was talking about himself. Solomon was going to die. He was going to be surrounded by people, but die alone. because he had forsaken these things in his life. He had wrote a lot of Proverbs, but he had not lived them. He had learned a lot of things, but he never lived it. And what's he saying for us? I think he's saying the conclusion of his life is this: I wish there was a do-over. And if I were to do it all over again, here's what I would do. Fear God and keep his commandments. And so what I'm telling you is to do it now. Don't delay. Remember God. Spend time with him. How's your personal time with God? Regard him. Listen to what he has to say and do it. Keeping his commandments. It'll bring peace. It'll bring an understanding. It'll bring a perspective where you'll understand your purpose. And that won't come with anything else outside of God. Those are the words of the preacher. And that is what he concludes. Let's listen to him today. Would you bow with me in prayer?